Hello, and welcome everyone who is joining us for the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm Vivian Schiller. I'm Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We are a program of the Aspen Institute that focuses on all things at the intersection of media, the internet, and technology. In this session, we are focusing on digital equity. While this is not a new problem, it took a global pandemic to truly expose and really raise public awareness about long-standing divide between those who do and those who do not have the access they need to technology tools that are so necessary to participate in the modern economy. We are lucky to have two leaders today who have dedicated their careers to this from each of those sectors. Rose Stuckey-Kirk is Senior Vice President and Chief Corporate Social Responsibility Officer at Verizon, where she is responsible for CSR investment strategy and programmatic build-out and oversees the strategic direction for all of Verizon's social impact marketing activity. Anish Chopra is the president of Care Journey, an open data membership service building a trusted, transparent rating system for physicians, networks, facilities, and markets on the move to value. He served as the first U.S. Chief Technology Officer under President Obama. That was from 2009 to 2012. And in 2014, he authored Innovative State, How New Technologies Can Transform Government. So Rose, let's start with you. And by starting with you, we're talking about the private sector, of course, which has largely built the infrastructure upon which digital equity will depend. Talk to us a little bit about what action is the industry overall, and of course Verizon specifically, doing to drive digital equity right now?
Yeah, look, I love the fact that we're using the term digital equity, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and with Anish, because I think when you think about this space holistically, you have to unpack it across not just building the infrastructure, but are you building the infrastructure in a way that you are allowing for the innovations that's going to have to happen to drive that equity? And what do those innovations look like? What's the partnerships that you build? You also have to think about the issue of affordability. And how do you ensure that everyone has access to what you are building and can afford it? And so that work that we're doing in terms of advocacy, thinking about subsidies, all of that really matters. And then you also have to think through application. I mean, you talked about it earlier in terms of access to education, access to healthcare. What does that mean holistically for the individuals whose needs we are trying to meet? We're thinking about and working on all of that at Verizon, because if you get that right, if you get all those components going, in the right way, and you get the flywheel effect, you're going to build the right public-private, sector partnerships, and you're going to really help lift communities in the right way. So just the short answer is we think about it across all those components: the access, the affordability, the advocacy, and the application that has to be in place to create digital equity.
So what does that look like exactly? In other words, what has changed in the last year when we faced this, crisis that is so acute in the last year and has really shined a bright light and frankly exacerbated a lot of the issues you're talking about affordability and adaptability?
So I think it's a couple of things. For Verizon, we were not new to this party, right? We recognize that these have always been the issues. And so the work that we have been doing is always across those four components. What has changed are a couple of things. One is you've seen the government, the Biden administration lean in even more aggressively and thinking about what are the emergency plans that we have to build out. But those are going to be short-lived. So what is important for us as we move forward is putting the right things in place to ensure that we can move beyond just that moment. And so that means that we are really aggressively looking at how we're building out our network, where we're building it out, how do we bring connectivity not only into rural locations, but also into those urban deserts that are equally important, and really making that large investment and moving that as quickly as possible. It's also the fact that more and more players now understand that you can't just put that connectivity out there. If you're going to engage in the education sector, everybody needs to understand what to do, right? The teacher suddenly has new skills that he or she has to learn. to figure out what a technology-rich education is going to look like and how to apply that. So one thing that's new is that more and more players are now in this space trying to help teachers figure that out. More and more players in education and healthcare figuring that out. So what has changed is this hyper awareness that people have to go deep, retrain, train, and actually apply sort of some of that learning, because we're never going to go back to the way we were. And this reality of being virtual in some form and being dependent upon the technology is important, and allowing for the innovation, whether it's through, ORAN or other ways that we're doing it, is going to be even more critical. So I think it's awareness, and it's more players engaging and being a part of the solution.
Thank you. We're going to come back to the issue of digital literacy in a little while. And of course, I may ask you to explain to our audience what ORAN is, as they may not all know what it is, but you can hold that thought. I'm going to go to Anish now. So Anish, of course, you are now in the private sector, but for years you served in the Obama White House driving technology strategy. And I know you're still very, very deeply engaged in these issues. So talk to us about the role of the public sector here. How can the public sector drive change in terms of the very issues that Rose is talking about?
Well, going back a decade or more, we've had a shift in thinking about the role of government in our economy. The traditional form of government in enabling an innovation economy had been about roadways, railways, and runways. And as you saw, going back 200 years, we've been making those public investments, even if there were private operators' implementation of those infrastructure investments. We felt the role of government was to include subsidy to make sure that the U.S. economy can compete globally. What we're seeing now, and we went from sort of nice to have to need to have with broadband, is a kind of a rethinking about the role of infrastructure in this innovation economy. And in the Obama administration, we reclassified infrastructure to include digital infrastructure, broadband. That also includes digital electricity, the electrical grid, the smart electrical grid, digital healthcare records, but also research and development and an educated workforce that can take advantage of these new technologies to compete. So Vivian, if you ask the question, the role of the public sector, if you think about what we've always done, create the conditions for the economic growth of the nation, then you would just simply acknowledge that there are new investments to be made to continue on that mission objective. And that's where we are today with broadband, and you're going to see, hopefully, additional investment to build out almost universal access to what is now critical infrastructure for a modern economy.
So you say traditionally the role of the government had been subsidy. Now you're talking about direct investment in those services, the digitization of social services, for example.
That is correct. And partly why we're doing this is we're acknowledging a few factors that are coming together at once. One is you want to lay the pipes to parts of the economy that don't have access. I think Rose did a great job describing the urban deserts in addition to rural, that most people have understood has been a challenge because of the high cost of infrastructure spread out on a smaller number of homes. Just makes the economics of that investment hard on its own P&L. So there has been historical interest in subsidizing hard to serve communities. However, as we look towards the applications that drive broader public policy priorities, we're seeing more direct investment. In the Obama administration, we put $10 billion to subsidize smart meters that would be internet connected devices that would allow utility companies to know exactly what our energy consumption patterns are so they can be more nimble and agile in their response. We put $35 billion into electronic health record subsidies, which also implied doctors and hospitals could connect and be on the internet to make sure patients got the most coordinated care they could. And we've obviously historically invested in electronic learning capability through the FCC's E-rate program to subsidize applications that ride for educational purposes. So we've made direct investments before, and you'll see more of that. Obviously, a big policy debate is what more can we do to subsidize access to this critical infrastructure for communities that need it the most. And COVID highlighted just the challenges of access to critical infrastructure when we were all struggling with lockdowns and the economy as a whole.
and the necessity of that, of access to that critical infrastructure when we were at lockdown, certainly. Rose, you have made the case that digital equity, I've heard you say before, isn't just about helping individuals, but it's about community cohesion. So how is that the case? How does connecting individuals, what has that got to do with bringing communities together?
Yeah, I think it has everything to do with it. I mean, think about one of the biggest things that we saw during the pandemic was how many small businesses we lost. And when you got underneath what was happening for a lot of those small businesses, particularly those that were owned by women, people of color, former, veterans, you found that a key problem is that they did not understand or have in place the digital technology that they needed to stay relevant and to compete. Most of our economy is driven by small businesses. So if you eliminate sort of this huge sector of the population that is driving economic opportunity, your communities are going to fail. And so recognizing that we've got to move into the space where people have access, where they understand the application, where they can think about it and apply it to their economic well-being within, the small business community, it's a perfect example, right, of why that's important. I think the other component is your whole education system. When you think through what we need to do to drive equitable education in a very zip code based environment, we see that those young people who don't have access to technology are often left behind. And the pandemic shone a light on that. It showed that brown people, black people, children were losing, over 18 months worth of learning during the pandemic compared to a white student who was only, having about a 9-month learning loss. That's going to impact your community long term. So when you think about community cohesion, that ability to see communities being uplifted, to see that the needs of that community are being met, then broadband access to technology is at the core of sort of that need. It's a huge driver. So that's the explanation that I would leave with you, and that's also the huge opportunity.
Do you see any resistance as you try to encourage this digital access and communities coming together? You talk about underrepresented communities and making sure they have equal access. How have these kinds of tools and services and efforts been embraced, and where do you see any resistance?
Yeah, I don't see resistance. I just see a need to go even further. So if you look at what we do, for example, inside of education, we are adopting middle schools around the country, particularly those where you have 65 to 75% of the youth who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And given that entire school system, every student and teacher and sort of administrator in that school access to technology 24/7, we're giving them the access, the devices, the curriculum, the ability to apply it to every subject matter. And it's not a matter of resistance. It's a matter of, can we go quicker? Can we go faster? Can we go harder at what it is that we're doing? In rural America, we're partnering with 4-H in order to bring digital literacy skills to very vulnerable at-risk populations in rural America to help them understand what the application is. So it's not a matter of resistance. It's a matter of the expectation that we do even more and that we do it as quickly as we can and that we figure out the right partners so that we can scale the work.
Well, let's drill down and let's talk a little bit more about digital literacy, because it's a huge barrier and it's tough to crack. And, it's not necessarily part of school curriculum. You have children who have been learning from home. Perhaps their families don't have the digital literacy they need to help their kids, and for older Americans as well. And yet it's completely necessary both for education, for job seeking, and for career advancement. So, Anish, I know you've thought a lot about digital literacy and how to make that sort of central across different industries. So how would that work?
Yeah, so I generally think in threes, and so if I may, just to kind of set the stage on this subject, there is an important aspect of our educational system to incorporate digital literacy as part and parcel of the educational experience. And so we subsidized a great deal of this in the Obama administration. Obviously, there's been a call to action to get more and more of the learnings of how to be digitally literate as part of your traditional K-12 experience so that you graduate ready to compete in the 21st century. And I think there's continued efforts to bring a curriculum innovation so folks understand how to engage in these new technologies to their own betterment. So this sort of door number one is let's lift up education in general and incorporate this as part of the curriculum. Number two, there's been a similar conversation about how to level the playing field, and might we do more to find underserved communities and nonprofit organizations and capacity build so that they can reach the frail elderly that are dependent on Medicare, Medicaid to live a healthier life, and the very people we need to engage the healthcare system more routinely so they don't end up in the emergency room because of a deterioration of their health status that was entirely preventable, would be to make sure that we can fund the kind of capacity building through public and private partnerships so we can lift up the most vulnerable. And that often links to the specific applications where we need them to be literate, the unemployed to understand how to do job seeking, those with learning disabilities to understand how to access a digital curriculum. So there's sort of a second chapter here, which is capacity building to get the neighborhoods in need connected. But there's actually a transformational dimension, which is, I think, the third leg of this stool, which is we have a market-driven economy, and to the extent that we can, more incentives, financial incentives, to drive the use of these digital technologies may have the sort of the benefit of the creativity of the innovation economy to find ways to get folks connected. If Netflix is going to look for another crop of customers because the digitally literate are already engaged, they're going to be investing in strategies to get new customers in. And that may not be the right analogy per se, but the theory is I do think the healthcare programs that are moving towards value-based care is creating a financial incentive for your doctor to make sure that the at-risk patient in their panel that may not have broadband access does learn how to communicate with their physician early enough to adjust their medications or to address their immediate needs before they result in that ER visit, because it's going to cost the system more and cost the health system, the physician networks that are taking responsibility for their care more. So as we look to create financial incentives to drive more value in public areas, in educational outcomes, health outcomes, and the like, we may see digital literacy as part of the way those organizations become successful.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that, and so Anish, if you think about that, when you then are looking at what is your next generation of technology, something like 5G, you recognize that enablement of 5G is going to remove so many of the barriers, right, that exist in terms of that ability to provide healthcare in a much more optimal way, to actually remake what education can and should look like so that we can take all the learnings from the pandemic that allowed us to think about education as a way that if more and more kids are virtual, how do you give them access to better teachers? How do you give them access to better opportunities? And so as we think through all of that, each layer of new technology, such as 5G, brings us more opportunity to ensure that application layer is cared for and those incentives are in place for people to participate in driving the needed innovation. You have to connect all those dots.
I couldn't agree more, and I would say this is probably you asked earlier of Rose, who's opposed to this? And it was like mom and apple pie, why would you be opposed to goodness, okay? Here's the issue. The minute you take advantage of these new technologies and you can take that physics class from the teacher in the best school system that cares for students like you, that's better at teaching the curriculum to engage you than your neighborhood school, now you've raised a policy question about competition in an area where we've not historically had it because of limitations of the physical plant. So the pandemic opened up the ability not only for me to go call my doctor who I would see otherwise in person, but now I can do so through a video conference. All of a sudden, with Rose's comments, I can actually find the doctor who cares for patients like me better than anyone in my neighborhood, and I can cut across state lines and get that health visit. We ran this experiment during the pandemic, and people all over the country were accessing healthcare in ways they had never imagined, talking to doctors they'd never physically met, getting care that might actually be better than if they relied on what they had available to them in their local physical neighborhoods. So the competition implications of having ubiquitous, high quality, affordable broadband might mean more competition in health, education, maybe even the energy grid in terms of managing your footprint in terms of how much energy you consume as a family. That has implications, Vivian, for public policy more broadly, because wait a minute, I wanted to digitize my local school so that kids can stay home and learn. I didn't mean for them to go take the class down the street, because am I going to write a check to that person for tuition? And how's that going to work when I get paid from property taxes? There's going to be a lot of policy debate that will be forced upon us because the technology makes the user experience better.
Yeah, and Anish, because I think that's fundamentally what it is. It isn't a matter of are you opposed? It's do we have the right policies? Are we thinking forward enough to think about what this change state would be? Because we will all say it's not going to go back to what it was. We just don't have the insight into what it can be and the potential of how we need to think about building that every day. Because the infrastructure is going to be there. The infrastructure, we're going to keep doing that work, building that out. It is all of that component on top of it that's fundamentally going to change, that everyone needs to be thinking more about, and frankly, in some cases, demanding that change, because that is going to give us the level of equalization that does not exist today in our society, and that's going to help lift some of these communities that we've been talking about.
Right. I mean, what you're talking about, what you're both talking about is the subject of this session is about equity. And what you're talking about, Anish and Rose, is if I now am connected and I have access to a better school and I'm not limited to maybe the poor school system, the inferior school system in my district, and there's another school system across town that might be more appropriate for me, I can have access to it. Is that not the definition of equity? But we can see how some might be.
Well, it's going to create strange policy bedfellows, Vivian, because those of us, and I obviously am a proud Democrat, we want everyone to reach their fullest potential, no matter who they are, what their skin color is, what their economic status is. We want everyone to be given the shot to live that American dream. The problem is going to be if that might result in institutions that have been funded for years that may not have been as effective now facing competition for the first time because of the very nature of this technology. And I don't know where that leads us, but it may be a whole new debate. What does school choice in the 21st century mean? It may not be about private school vouchers versus public school vouchers. It might be the public school in Oakland does a far better job than the one in Petersburg in caring for a heavily African-American population focused on scientific excellence. Maybe. And that may be the question mark on the table, is how does one now realize the full potential here so that everyone gets the learning in the way that they learn the best, or health outcomes, or anything else that falls into that public domain.
But what's interesting about that is it's also such opportunity, because the entire ecosystem of who has to deliver that equality is going to change, right? So the way that you educate a teacher, even inside of the college, the way that colleges have to think about their curriculum, the way that you have to think about doctors, to your earlier comment, and how you are training them and what they need to be incentivized to do, what's going to happen inside of your pharmacy companies as they think about that. The whole ecosystem now is going to have to step back and think about what is next going to look like, and who do we not leave behind in the process of this. And that is our scary moment, and also our opportunistic moment that is going to start occurring. And I think education is going to help lead the way, frankly, because there is a true understanding that we have got to sort of level this playing field in terms of individuals who've been left behind because of the pandemic, and we got to move them forward. So I'm excited, honestly, about what that potential can be if we start figuring out how to move that ecosystem holistically.
Vivian, if I may just piggyback on this, we started this conversation about the communities that struggle and how to close that gap, and focusing on the equity debate. And that is that last mile between the individual, the family, and the service that they need. But Rose just raised an issue that actually I think is the 80 of the 80-20 rule, assuming we will work our way through the equity issue. How do teachers write curriculum today in order to be successful to connect the kids in their classroom. Many of them are still handing down paper-based, stapled curricula from teachers of the past. And there's been this like very soft, informal economy about how to train the trainer, how to get folks equipped to close those gaps. Imagine a world, we tried to launch this in the Obama years, and actually, Rose, Verizon was very generous to support some of this as public-private partnership. How do we create these digital learning compendium such that a teacher in a community that's struggling doesn't just rely on her local friends and family to get feedback on how to teach the egg toss game, but could go online and access that same information from the very best in their peer group all over the country. That kind of sharing amongst those who are otherwise in these communities of economic distress or of higher racial diversity, they may find the technologies actually helping them help their communities in a better way. That traditional B2B, lack of a better term, business-to-business relationship with broadband might actually be the 80-20 rule of impact, in addition to whether we get that last mile connected.
What I love about this conversation is we started off talking about why we need broadband, why we need connection, why we need digital literacy. And now what we've moved on to, which is so fascinating, is all of the knock-on effects, yes, there will be some growing pains and teachers may need to relearn how to build curriculum, but all of the opening up of and equity potential that could come from it. As we're going towards just, unfortunately, our last remaining minutes, I want to just ask each of you a final question, and it's going to be an inverse of the first question I asked you. I started by asking, Rose, you from the private sector, what does the private sector do and need to do? Anish, the public sector. I want to now ask the opposite, which is, Rose, I'd like for you to tell me, what do you need as Verizon, as the private sector industry? What do you need from the public sector? What do you need government to do for you to be successful? And Anish, what does the public sector need from the private sector in order to provide for the citizenry?
So what's important to me from the private sector is, look, we are building solutions. Even if I think about on my team, and to the very last comment that Anish said, we're building an online platform, a highly digital online platform using the best technology with the best curriculum that teachers can access it inside their classrooms. What I need are partners who can help us build that as we think about that next generation of technology, extended reality, artificial intelligence, all the things that we're putting into that platform. I need the partners to come help us build that out. What I need the government to do is to recognize that they have an obligation to really be clear about what is needed in the marketplace and where it is needed, and ensuring that they are thinking about it, not in a generic sense, but in a very clear sense about what the application is and what the policy implications are, and what needs to be put into place to level that playing field with good policy, not good regulation, but good policy that's actually going to enable the future that we want. So those are my two asks.
Yeah, we need to drive productivity in the cost of this last mile delivery of broadband infrastructure. So right now, the debate about access, and we talked about investment, and the public sector said, okay, we're going to have to underwrite some of the costs of the last mile, but it assumed, Vivian, at the beginning of our dialogue, that the cost of that last mile is X, and it's going to be 10% more than X next year and 10% more than that the year after. My ask and my call to action, frankly, is we've got to take advantage of all of the new technologies to lower the costs of last mile delivery, absent subsidy. So how do we get 50% less cost to deliver last mile broadband in communities that need it most? And you heard Rose mention some of these technologies like ORAN, the open source radio access network. We have the potential to lower the input costs, which would make the subsidies in many cases lower, maybe even down to zero, if the private sector could take leadership role in focusing collaboratively on that last mile. Imagine a crazy world where Verizon and AT&T share the same infrastructure and render only in the software that these bits belong to Verizon and these bits belong to AT&T. That would reduce the capital spend for infrastructure, so we don't have a AT&T tower and a Verizon base station and a T-Mobile. That to me is the ask. Let's collaborate to lower the last mile costs.
Rose Stuckey-Kirk, Anish Chopra, thank you both so much. There's so much to unpack here, and half an hour is not nearly enough time. But I really appreciate all your remarks, and we will continue the conversation at another time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, everybody.